welcome back. And most people are probably thinking, and I understand it, the Dust Bowl, I mean, mildly interesting at best. Who really cares? It was a long time ago. The trouble with that is, it was a fascinating time in American history, and it totally changed life for everyone from then on. By 1933, the United States, as a corporation, was bankrupt. They had to reorganize their debts. They outlawed the ownership of private gold. Imagine a government telling you that you cannot own an element found in nature. You got to turn it in. We'll give you some coupons for it. You know, you're not out anything. But you can't own that. Nope, sorry. Moreover, the entire legal system changed. We were based off the Constitution. That's the law of the land. Well, they came up with the UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code. That's maritime law, the law of the sea. And courts to this day will not recognize case law prior to usually about 1938 or 1940. Whole different system. But more to the point, the Dust Bowl era, they called it the Dirty 30s. It was so bad. Massive dust storms came out of the northwest, I believe, and just wreaked havoc upon the nation. And you didn't know when they were coming. It was like a blizzard of dust. The entire earth was in the sky now. A really, really good book. I've read several on the Dust Bowl years and the Dirty 30s and the Depression era and all that stuff, but a really good book is called The Worst Hard Time by Timothy Egan. In the 1920s, promoters really tried to develop the panhandle part of the United States, clear from Mexico to Canada. This is basically uninhabitable land. I think there's around 3 million people that live in this section of America, present day. And they make it because of technology. They make it because they have the automobile, because they can drive 60 miles to the nearest store, and they want a quiet, secluded life, and I understand it. But it's basically uninhabitable. The rainfall kind of drops off, coming from east to west right before that. It's arid. They used to call it the Great American Desert. Well, in the 1920s, developers and promoters and a bunch of charlatans and fraudsters tried to promote this to their own benefit, of course. You know, we'll sell you some land, and I don't even know half the time they even owned it to sell. Be that as it may, people that wanted a new start figured, what the heck, and went out there and they financed tractors and they started tilling the ground. Hundreds of thousands of acres in this section, especially in Texas, were tilled and planted. But there isn't enough water to grow these crops. Meanwhile, all this dust they stirred up in the air is what they blamed it on. It's probably partially true. I don't really know. Whatever the case, all this dust went into the air and there was no rain. So you got to compound all these factors. The financial strains of the country. People were out of work. People were zigzagging the nation looking for work, looking for anything. There was no social net at this time, no safety net. There was no food stamps, no public relief, no unemployment insurance, none of that stuff. And when you went hungry, you just went hungry until you found something to eat. People from that time, a lot of them, you know, or would speak about their parents or their grandparents. We were too proud to take any kind of relief. And in a lot of ways, that's nonsense. If that was the case, you weren't really struggling like some of those people were struggling. I mean, when you have nothing to eat, that's all you think about is getting something to eat. Now, a guy like me that comes along 80 years later or whatever it's been now, it's real easy for a guy like me to say, why didn't they stand up? Why didn't they stop? You know, what do you mean the government said you can't own gold? Why didn't you stand up? The trouble with that is people are just trying to live. It's easy to say things like that when your belly is full. Historically, writers and authors and educators and whoever would tell you it's the greatest generation. Oh, they were so tough and they just could tough through anything. They had no choice. They're just trying to live. They're trying to find their next meal. So meanwhile, the government's gone haywire and they've racked up a bunch of debt that they can't pay for and everything else. So they got to take your gold to pay for it, which is exactly what they did. You're just trying to live. So you have to couple this. The legal system went haywire. The money system went haywire. The government went haywire. Natural plagues of dust storms coming massive. I mean, you can't imagine unless you were there or have seen photographs. These dust storms, it was a blizzard of dust. You couldn't breathe. The cars at the time, vehicles were out and about in the 1930s. The electrical systems would short out and the vehicle would die and you couldn't restart it. So people started bolting chains to their bumpers and they would drag the chain all the time because you didn't know when a dust storm was coming. And that would ground the car out and you could still operate it. But you couldn't see to drive the thing. In that book, The Worst Hard Time, there's a lot of individual accounts. One lady, the dust was just tremendous. It would infiltrate every crook and cranny and nook of your house. And the houses weren't built as well back then, or at least as tight against nature. And so this dust just permeated. While they slept, they would put wet blankets or wet sheets over baby cribs to keep the babies from inhaling this dust while they slept. And a lot of them died, what they called dust pneumonia. And they'd open up their lungs and just be mud from all the dust they breathed. They'd try tacking strips of cloth or leather underneath the windowsills. They tried everything, trying to keep this dust out, and it just wasn't possible. And a lot of times they'd wake up in the mornings and take a shovel and shovel the dust out of the house. There was that much of it. Ceilings collapsed from the weight of the dust in the attic. You might could get the whole house relatively clean. And we thought about the attic. And so the dust went and settled in there and settled in and settled in day after day after day. And pretty soon the ceiling might collapse from the weight of the dust. One lady in the book, every day she got the house relatively clean and she put on white gloves and sat prim and proper and had her tea because she was going to enjoy 30 minutes of living a normal, polite, societal life like she had known before. 30 minutes out of every day. I mean, it seems absurd, but you and I didn't have to live like that. And this wasn't modern day disasters. You know, people remember, especially if they were in it, the Texas ice storms of a couple years back in the winter. Well, it was that, I don't know, 9-10 days. And it was a hard time for everybody. And I get it. But we're talking about years and years. It was basically a decade. The stock market went belly up. Everybody's unemployed. The whole nation practically is unemployed, it seemed like. Or if you could get a job, it might last 2 months or 6 months. Guys were hopping trains, zigzagging across. Both of my grandparents went through it. My dad was born in 1927. So in the 30s, he's growing up. And that marked him for life. He never forgot that. He didn't throw away anything, ever. He would reuse the string out of the dog food bags. It's still in there. You buy a bag of dog food, you know, the top's got the pull string. Back then, they were a little more robust than they are now. But he would save that and patch his overalls with it. They had the money to buy thread. That was better thread. It's durable. It's free. Comes with dog food. It's like when you're young and you go through that, part of that is part of you now. And you know what it's like to go without, and you don't ever want to go through that again. He would reuse tires. A lot of my youth was spent picking up nails off of job sites, and it was my job to sit and put them in the vise and straighten them out and peck them and put them in the coffee can. And he used them. I mean, he had the money to go buy a box of nails when he needed them. That's just wasteful. Why do they throw this stuff out? They throw out everything. And when you've gone through that for years of your life, especially as a young person, you don't forget easily. And he never forgot that. On my mother's side of the family, my grandparents there, her parents, they were farmers and they went through, you know, the dirty 30s. And I want to say there was a 2 or almost 3 year period where there was zero money in the house. None. Not a dollar, not a quarter. These guys were traveling all over the country looking for work, and so people would come to their door and rap on the door, and, you know, I'm traveling and passing through. Do you have anything to eat? Because they had nothing, and they had no money to get anything. Initially, my grandparents on that side, they would feed them, and then it just be, well, you know, it's like feeding a stray dog when then it's going to come back. Or the word gets out amongst the traveling guy, hey, you need food, you go to that house. And they just couldn't do it. It wasn't like they were living in the lap of luxury. They were barely getting by themselves. They had a garden and a farm and their own livestock, so they could eat. Couldn't make any money to speak of, but they could eat. So eventually they started saying, you know, well, I'll trade you a meal if you can do a little work. Can you pull weeds in the garden? Can you split some firewood or whatever? These men were never allowed in the house. It was always treated with a skit. You know, they don't know who they are. And so they would bring them a plate full of food to eat on the front porch or the front stoop there. But they had to earn it. A totally different way of life. Now, on top of all these aforementioned things, you also had grasshopper plagues, I think around 1936. Massive influx, I'm talking like of biblical proportions. That plague came out of the northeast. They'd cloud out the sun. And any green thing that could grow through all this dust, the grasshoppers just mowed it down to nothing. Unbelievable. You had to have thought, well, this is it. The world is ending. There are also these, I forget what they called the term, but the rabbit killings. For wild rabbits and wild game, they didn't have anything to eat either. So they're zigzagging every which way looking, and there, for some reason there was this influx of wild rabbits. And people that are starving, well, here's all these rabbits. So they'd put out a flyers and as a big rabbit roundup, you know, on Saturday. And they'd bunch them all together on a baseball diamond backstop or something, and the men would club them with pipes. The noise of that marked those children for the rest of their lives, because rabbits scream when, you know, you can look that up on your own time. We're talking thousands upon thousands of slaughtered rabbits. Now you had some food to take home, such as it was, and you were darn glad to get it. People survived by and large early on by the goodwill of their neighbors, vegetable gardens, maybe you had one cow or something. Eventually the government kept trying things. The government virtually caused it in a large part, and then they made it worse. They'd come through and they might pay initially, I think it was $3 per head of cow. And you lined up all these starving cattle and shot them in the head and bulldozed them into a ditch. And the government gave you $3 a head, and then it became $1 a head. And $1 a head was better than $0. They were just going to die anyway of the dust pneumonia or starve to death. Hard times, man. Eventually the government came out with all these work programs, make work programs. The CCC guys that built state parks. I mean, they did a lot of good work, don't get me wrong, but it was make work stuff, and none of it pulled America out of the Great Depression. It's often argued that it wasn't until World War II, the men left, the women built munitions and factories that they had converted to war machines, basically. And when the men came back, now you had a robust economy. You had to convert the factories back. People started gaining money. The natural order of things, the weather patterns even out. All the dust finally did settle. We're talking like 1940s here. Things kind of got back to quote unquote normal life, and eventually really prospered in the 50s. Arguably that was the greatest financial time in modern America to be alive and to be a young adult. But to go through that Dust Bowl, man. And I don't know that, I mean, people might have been a little tougher, but by and large, you're as tough as you gotta be. They were just trying to live. It's interesting stuff, I think. You might check out that book, The Worst Hard Time, it's called, if you're interested in such things. Anyway, I thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and appreciate the like and subscribe. That helps the channel grow. Thanks again. See you next time.